Si Zeus Mossy, Dr. Viernes James, and all the panelists that are going to be in this program today. It's very difficult for me to summarize the concept of the lunch within the given time that I have for this program. So let me try to summarize it and try to bring the highlights of the lunch concept. First of all, let's look at the word lunch, which is not a Chamorro word. That's a Spanish loan word, which means a ranch. The associated individuals to a lancho is lanchero, a farmer, but male. Lanchera, a farmer, but female. Lancheria is more a diminutive. That again is a Spanish word, which means a smaller scale lunch. So historically, how did the lancho evolve in the history among the Chamorros and in the Mariana Islands? After the arrival of the missionaries in 1668, and this is all documented now, it's not oral history, the Chamorro depopulation, the most severe in recorded history in the Pacific, narrowed down to almost 3,000. In some reports, it was 1,800 in the entire Mariana Islands. That eventually the Spanish, or the Spanish colonial government, moved the Chamorros and settled the Chamorros only in 2 places in the Marianas, meaning the rest were depopulated. And that is Guam, and the other is Rota. They were never depopulated in the history of the Mariana Islands, and the Chamorros continued. So the Chamorros were brought into an urban type lifestyle. And so the Spanish created what they call the pueblo, which means a village. In Chamorro, it's called a sonso. And in this concept of the pueblo, in the Spanish concept, the Chamorro population were put together in basically 7 villages, historic, and till today remain. That is Hagatnya, Piti, Aniguac, Essen, Malesu, Inalahan, Pagat, and Pago, or 7 distinct villages during the Spanish period. So how did the lancho evolve through there? Because it was a population in a concentrated area, as you've seen in the earlier slide, if there's one of Agatnya. The people were living next to each other. There was no room to grow anything or to survive with the space given by the Spanish colonial government. So the concept of the lancho evolved, and the Chamorros were given that privilege to reconnect with the land through the lancho system. Now, in my generation, and I'm born post-war, 1951, I was so fortunate that I had a dual residence. The residence of a village and the residence of a lancho. Neither is secondary, they're both primary. And in growing up in that way, as I look back now through the years, the reason why the lancho in the Chamorro culture is very pivotal, important, significant, is that it is the only place really that you can learn Natsamodo, you are Chamorro. Truly, you couldn't learn from the village. That's colonial. So the lancho is an extension of the legacy of hundreds of years from the first people who came here and lived in these islands. And one perfect example of that is on Guam, and Rota, the entry of traditional named places in Chamorro is so significant, and the numbers, it's almost unthinkable that almost every space was named. Unfortunately, to the Northern Marianas, because it was depopulated, many of those place names did not survive. When the Chamorros returned, they were again remembered the names and still use the names to today. Going back to the concept of the Lancho. Chamorro, but I never learned what is Chamorro in the school system. Even till today, we don't. Look at the educational system of Guam. It was the Lancho that was the anchor of Chamorro culture, really, as I remembered it growing up here in Guam. Now, it goes beyond the economics. It's sociological and psychological too. Because in the Lancho, you are Chamorro, so you live like a Chamorro. And you were divorced from the Western ways. You're divorced from Western administration, Western whatever. You are at the Lancho, Chamorro. When you go back to the village, and that's what they have to do, like my parents' generation, they're back to more the Western ways. Now, like I said, there is so much to say about the Lancho. In World War II, the Lancho was the anchor of Chamorro survival. Why? Because when Japan took over, I don't use occupation, I say administration, because they all were administrators of the area, from the Germans to the Spanish. The Lancho anchored the Chamorros to their survival because that is where they went during those years here in Guam. To be again removed from another alien culture that they did not know of and they had to deal with. I think I mentioned in the other episodes that in my recollection of talking to the elders, I just found it fascinating, especially in the CNMI, because Guam had 3, CNMI had 4, that my elders lived under the Spanish period. When the Germans came, they were still living. When the Japanese came, they were still living. And when the Americans came, they were still living. Imagine, really, in your historical, in your journey, to live under 4 different administrations with 4 different guidelines, rules, and regulations, 4 different languages that was required. But some of the very educated Chamorros spoke all 4 languages. It was not a problem. Today, we don't do that. The younger generation only speaks English. They're monolingual. Unfortunately, I'm bilingual with Chamorro through my parents. But these are the things that the, going back to the sociological and psychological, it's a place or a sanctuary to be who you are, and even till today. So when I was growing up here in Guam, my father and mother required us to go to the Lancho. It was not an option. It was a must. That's the way it was. And so we went there. And so what did I do? All right, we tend to the plants because my mother was into planting, but my father was husbandry. So we tended to the pigs. 50 in one case in our Lancho in Saguian, my dad had 200 pigs to tend to. Imagine that number, but he did. So the Lancho concept is very important in the Chamorro culture. Unfortunately, today, the Lancho has become more and more of the past. And the only reason why really the Lancho has become more and more in the past is because these land holdings that the Chamorros had prior to the war and also after the war, when they brought in the infrastructure to these places, water and power, they moved to these Lanchos and remained there. But my father, no. And my mother, no. and I lived in 3 different villages here in Guam in my lifetime, we still had a Lancho in the 3 villages that I lived in. That's Zigu, Mongmong, and Odlu. And like I said again, it's really a place, it's a sanctuary. It's almost not describable, but you know, when in my days of, and I went to cathedral Catholic schools and all that, when I went to the Lancho, I forgot all of that. And I said, Maria, this is you. This is definitely you. This is your family. This is your history. All right. And these nations came in, and that's one of the stories. Now, going back to the Lancho also is, and I don't know whether it was alluded earlier, is the land tenure system. In Chamorro, and I'll focus on this, the elders said, Itano, the land, the land may not enrich you. Though Itano, but the land, the land would never forsake you, would never leave you hungry. And this is why it's very important to understand the ownership of land among the Chamorros. And they fought all this land takings from the very beginning, from the time of the Spanish, even till today. And because of that concept, na itano, tiuni na gefsaga, lo tiun na nyolen. Now, what did I learn from the Lancho in terms of living as a Chamorro? The word is utas, that's one of them. And look at the multitude of proverbs derived from that one word. Utas means to be, oh my God, it's even hard to describe it in English. They don't have an English word for this word, utas in Chamorro, but it just means to be frugal, I guess. That's what it is, right? Not to be, that's why the elders and the Coaches, Maria, why do we have, or my sisters, why do we have 100 jars of mayonnaise underneath the sink? Because my mom would save every single one of them. Or the coffee can, the 5-pound coffee can that they used to sell in the store, because my mother would not throw anything away. Na utas. And the reason why that was my mother's, what do you call that, cultural habit, is because these are the proverbs that evolved from the word utas. Na utas, now always be careful of everything that is in front of you, nature and everything, and so that there will always be something for tomorrow. Na utas at the Hagwa, put things aside, because you are not the only one. There's a future generation. You learned that at the Lancho. Na utas zamege ufan manyagi, meaning be sparing so that many can receive the bounty of what is given by nature. Na utas zamunga na utaza, be sparing so that one day, hopefully it will never come, that there is nothing more. Na utas sagwa agupa, again, just be sparing because there's always tomorrow. And really this one word, and I wrote this in the book of Proverbs, I'm sorry, in the second edition of the book of Proverbs, because it is one word that I think every Chamorro, not just Chamorro, but humanity, to understand man, itauto, itano, the land, itasi, and the ocean, because we're all connected. And the other thing that, I mean, so many things really come into my mind of the Lancho spirit. Now, the other thing that you learn from the Lancho is the concept of Geltau, and Chamorros would go like this. You see, you can't understand Chamorro really if the language, it's very inherent, because those are the concepts, the way it was transmitted to me. So Geltau means to be giving, right? Sato means not to be giving. But when you look at the word and how it's derived, the etymology of the word, Geftao means gof tao tao. That person is an excellent being. Geftao tao. The word is tao tao. They cut out the one syllable and it just became geftao. Sato is the same thing. Sat tao tao. That person is not a human being because he's not giving. Sato, the negative. And so, what do you learn from Ilansu in the Chamorro concept is reading the Geftao, the Adahi, the Utas, which I never learned in school. And I went through this educational system for 12 years reading. I have to say that. The value systems, did we really learn that? Were they Chamorro value systems? Do we have to negate them today as the younger generation proceeds to the future? What are we inheriting them? What are we trying to impart to the younger generation, not just Chamorros, but the people of Guam? And these are all very, to me, inherent Chamorro values. The Lancho concept too, I have to allude to this. Traditional food gathering, fishing and all that. The Lancho introduced what we call formal agriculture. That's the way the Spanish wanted to call it, formal agriculture. Why? Because they introduced the corn. Well, that came in from the Americans. They introduced the kamuti. That's a very favorite staple of mine, the sweet potato. And many of the other things that we cultivate under what they call formal agriculture. And just to remind everybody, that's how the carabao came to the Marion. Carabao is the carabao. I'm pronouncing it the Chamorro way. And they use the carabao for, what do you call that? Aladu. Aladu, when you're tilting the ground, you know, when, oh, okay, yeah, that's what it is. I'm sorry. Sometimes I twist it with the two languages. But that's why, and my dad, we had 20 carabaos at one time. And they were used to, so there are so many things that I would like to share to you about the concept of the Lancho. But I think that's enough to kind of open your mind as to, you know, why it is very, very important to understand that from food to culture to lineages, everything. The Lancho is the place to know Chamorro. Sendong ko na si Zeus mo.
Si Diyos Masi Malia for sharing your wisdom with us. Couple of things that you bring up that I just want to highlight is many of the proverbs that you share. I personally would like to thank you for that work that you've done to spend time with elders to collect these proverbs. For those of you who are tuning in today who may not be familiar, Malia's work has brought together many proverbs which you would never hear probably today in everyday speech, but has been able to collect these proverbs that contain the wisdom of our elders. It's certainly one of my favorite historical resources that I've used and cited you in many publications. So thank you for that. One of the things that you bring up, Malia, that I think segues very nicely into the rest of our speakers today is that the Lancho is, reflective of this legacy. As you say, the legacy of the thousands of years from the first people that came to our islands to those of us who live in the islands today. It reminds me of a student I once had at the University of Guam. In a history of Guam classroom, we were talking about the Lancho, and he raised his hand. This is a quiet student that never really had much to say. When we were talking about the Lancho, though, he rose his hand and he said, my uncles, I'm a central boy, but my uncles, they maintain my tata's ranch in Trigo. And he said, the Lancho is the only place you can be Chamorro nowadays. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, It's the only place you can speak Chamorro, you can jam Chamorro music, you can eat hardcore Chamorro food. I said, what is hardcore Chamorro food? And he said, oh, you know, like fritada. I said, okay. And he goes, yeah, you know, if you do that anywhere else in Guam, you're a chod. People look down on you. And that was very profound to me from a 19-year-old to say that this space was the space that allowed him to be, when the rest of society, when the rest of the island was telling him that's not the way to be. And so you bring that up, that the Lancho is a vehicle for the continuity of our value. That in the school system, in the city life, you know, we're constantly told to leave that at home, but the Lancho is a place for us to not only survive, but to thrive. So thank you for pointing that out. And so, you know, with that being said, I do want to turn it over to our next speaker, who has a lot to share about his work with the Lancho, but also as a parent raising beautiful young people. I want to turn it over to Simeon, who can share with us a bit of your views on the Lancho and your experience and its role today. Simeon, welcome.